NAIA is the leader of the pack when it comes to not only identifying these issues, but coming up with solutions to the importation of these dogs that can carry diseases that can affect our dogs and us. Patty and NAIA and Julian have spent many years researching the problems and came up with a solution, which is the Healthy Dog Importation Act. We're extremely pleased that the head of our lobby group, Action Here, is here with us today, who's going to be giving you an update on this. This is Andrew Harker, who joined the Russell Group in 2007 following an internship with the House Agriculture Committee. Since then, he has led a number of the Russell Group's coalition efforts, including management of the Coalition for Safe, Affordable Food, successfully preempting a GMO labeling law, and shepherded the federal rulemaking of a workable uniform disclosure standard. Andrew has also managed coalitions dealing with key federal policies related to animal health and welfare standards, consumer product labeling, and international trade. And he's going to be giving us an update on the Healthy Dog Importation Act, after which we will have questions and answers of him and Dr. Christie. We're thrilled with this group. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
All right, thank y'all. Thank y'all for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks, Patty, for inviting me. Enjoyed visiting with some of y'all last night and hopefully get to interact with some of you today. I was encouraged with getting to get a good sense of the organization of NAIA's members and the fondness for animals, the love of animals. I was thinking about my wife's grandfather, who was a third-generation cattle farmer, third-generation miller, and as he got old, he's in his 90s, he didn't want to get up to come to the dinner table, and his two sons took a lot of effort to try to get him going, and he finally said on Thanksgiving, I'm not going to eat, I'm not coming to the table. And so one of the sons went over to the window and said, called his brother over and said, look, the cows are loose. You left the gate open, the cows are loose. And so the other brother came over and said, well, I didn't leave it open, you left it open, now they're all out. And her grandfather ran over to the window and said, the cows aren't loose, y'all are making stuff up. And my wife's dad said, yeah, that's true, but the good news is your legs are feeling better. So he joined us for dinner. But it was that love of animals, that was what drove him, was farming, also running the grist mill. But enjoy being with you all, and that mindset, that energy it's very apparent, and it's nice to be around it. Maybe just a couple things. We had Dr. Peterson talk a little bit about some of the issues that are associated with dog imports. I'll talk a little bit about the legislation that we have as a solution that she pointed to, and it really is kind of a multi-pronged effort, because as you can see, there are a lot of challenges out there associated with imports because of the number of federal agencies involved, and in some ways not involved, right? Because they have pieces of oversight over different aspects, whether it's USDA or CDC or CBP, but they don't all have ownership. No one entity has, kind of primary ownership over the effort. I think I'll start with just 2021 and what we saw happen there. And that was really, I think, the most action we've seen on dog importation since Patty started this campaign from a federal regulatory and legislative aspect. The bill that was introduced, the Healthy Dog Import Act, was introduced in the House and in the Senate. And maybe I'll just give you just a quick, brief overview about what that bill would do, because it's really some reasonable, basic principles that a lot of folks would already think, well, aren't we already doing that? And the answer is no, we're not. One, a dog imported would require a certificate of veterinary inspection. Now, dogs moving interstate have to have that already, but if you're coming from overseas, you don't have to have that. Two, a permanent ID. As we heard from Dr. Parachi, the fraudulent nature of which many of these dogs are coming in, their paperwork doesn't line up with them, and that is something that you can partially address by having a permanent ID tied to the document that they're arriving with. And then third is vaccinations required by the secretary. So right now, the only oversight we have specifically on any given disease is on rabies, that the CDC requires that rabies vaccination certificate. Outside of that, you see very little federal oversight over specific diseases associated with dog imports. And one of the ways that we would accomplish having greater oversight is by putting the authority of dog importation at veterinary services under USDA instead of animal care. Because what we're talking about is an animal health issue. It is animal welfare, but it's primarily veterinary services that we think has better equipped. They already do this for cattle, for poultry, for equine. And as Dr. Peterson pointed out, the focus of the department so often is on production agriculture, livestock, and poultry. If we put this under veterinary services, we get that attention that we want on this issue, right? You have those that are focused every day on animal health, serological testing, quarantine, et cetera, at USDA with their eyes on this, and that is a big piece of this bill. I want to reiterate the reasonableness of these provisions. I mean, virtually every major developed country is already requiring this of dogs coming from the U.S. or any other country to their country. And that, as we have gone along, resonates pretty well with members of Congress, right, to point out we're behind China, we are behind Brazil, we are behind everybody on this issue. And that has resonated really well. So the bills were introduced in the House and the Senate, as I mentioned. Congressman Schrader, the lone veterinarian in the whole Congress, is our lead sponsor in the House. He's joined by Congressman Dusty Johnson, who is the ranking member on the House Agriculture, Livestock, and Trade Subcommittee from South Dakota. In the Senate, it's Senator Grassley from Iowa and Senator Smith from Minnesota. So you'll see both bills are bipartisan with their lead sponsors. And then since then, we have plugged along adding co-sponsors to the bill. And you'll see a little bit later the balance that we have from a partisan perspective. So we haven't overloaded the bills with Republicans or Democrats. It's very even, and we are targeting, as we'll talk about a little later, members on the House Agriculture Committee and on the House Appropriations Committee. Speaking of appropriations, another thing that we worked on besides introduction of the bills, reintroduction of the bills last year, was getting some federal funding. We heard a little bit earlier from Dr. Parachi about resources and the need for more funding. We heard that a lot on the Hill. I'm reminded of, many of you all may remember Julian Prager's email signature. At the bottom, he had a quote from Albert Einstein, and I'll just read it. "Nothing is more destructive of respect for the government and the law of the land than passing laws which cannot be enforced." And so we are, we are heeding that advice from the great Albert Einstein and our dear friend Julian, and we were successful in securing $1 million in the FY 2022 budget. So it was the first time that Congress had included money for this issue in the federal budget, and they also included in the budget language that accompanied that, directing USDA in stronger oversight of dog imports. And I'll just read the language that accompanied the funding from the Senate Ag Appropriations bill, because it's a little shorter. The House language is actually, about a quarter of our bill, not quite, but it's pretty extensive, especially for an issue that's not been acknowledged before by the Congress. But the committee is aware that the USDA issued a report that showed over 1 million dogs are imported into the U.S. each year. Of that number, however, less than 1% are subject to thorough health screening to show that they are healthy, vaccinated, and free of disease prior to entering the country. It's fascinating, right? This is now the words of the U.S. Congress. The limited health requirements and inspection has resulted in the importation of animals that arrive in poor health, as well as the importation of animals carrying various diseases from rabies to canine influenza to leptospirosis, among other things. Diseases such as canine rabies have cost millions of dollars to eradicate in the U.S., unscreened animal imports threaten to undo that progress while threatening public health. Therefore, the committee directs APHIS, which is the agency at USDA, to strengthen its oversight of imported dogs, including stronger interagency coordination to better protect animal and public health. Now, similar language was included in the House Agriculture Appropriations Bill. Both of those directives to the agencies stand as part of the budget, and then in the final bill, $1 million was included to go to USDA to strengthen their oversight. Maybe I'll just pivot, and I haven't advanced the slides at all because they're really not that impressive. But I'll talk a little bit about the key administrative actions too that happened last year. Now, you heard Dr. Parachi talk a little bit about CDC's suspension. I think obviously that was the most notable. It was the one that obviously has gained the most attention by the folks that are taking advantage of the lack of oversight in the system and bringing in dogs with fraudulent papers, because I know that they have raised those concerns with members of the House, and they have raised those concerns with CDC. And as Dr. Parachi alluded to, this suspension won't last forever, but it was fascinating to see the CDC, some of their statements that they included in their federal order they sound a lot like what NAIA and others of you have been saying for quite some time. And I'm sorry to read, but I'm going to read because I think it's important to remember that this is now a Federal Register publication in the Federal Register from the CDC's own words about this issue that has not been a priority for years in the past, right? And now we're seeing it become a priority. The efforts are coming to fruition. CDC has documented instances of fraudulent paperwork for dogs based on various factors. These include dogs that were younger than the age indicated, based on dental examination by U.S. veterinarians, differences between the breed, sex, color, or microchip number. You get the point. There's a lot of efforts to go around the limited requirements that are in place. The increase in the number of dogs inadequately vaccinated against rabies that importers are attempting to import into the U.S. has created a public health risk of importing CRVV into the U.S., and public health management of these dogs is unsustainable during the current COVID-19 pandemic. So just wrap your minds around the fact that now we have the Congress speaking to this issue. We also now have CDC taking some efforts, I think a drastic effort, right, to go from zero oversight to say we're not going to bring dogs in from 113 countries. Now, I think the one thing to think about there is it's only high-risk rabies countries that are impacted, and you saw the number up there. It's about 10% of the annual imports. So we still got to deal with the other 90%. In addition to CDC's notice, we also had a federal order issued by USDA. Now, this was focused on African swine fever and the risk of bringing in African swine fever on the crates or bedding of imported dogs. And that's an issue that we have been talking about on the Hill. It actually was mentioned in the House version of the appropriations language as an issue that needed to be addressed. It's one that gets a lot of attention. As Dr. Peterson mentioned, we're keeping in mind this whole time the focus of these agencies on public health, but also on food animals, right? I mean, because of the economics, because of the importance of the food value chain, that is what captures the attention. So that is why we have continued to point to this issue. This potential threat is one that we want to see resolved. And USDA put in place restrictions on dogs imported from any country that's known to have African swine fever. That was done in August of 2021. It was shortly after the CDC's notice and shortly after Congress acted with their budget directives to the agencies. A couple other things to note here. These numbers here, so APHIS import permits. When we had our first meeting with APHIS, with Patty, and we sat down with the deputy administrator and talked through how many dogs they have coming through USDA system, we were stunned to find out that in 2017, APHIS only issued 5 permits covering 35 dogs for the entire year. Now you fast forward to after we have now all weighed in and brought attention to this issue, Now they're issuing import permits for 15,000 dogs, and that number was just released a couple of weeks ago. So 15,000, and then you've got 10% covered by CDC. Both the USDA, though, ASF order and the CDC suspension are temporary. So, we have to keep working to ensure that these are longer term maintained. And the way we do that, ensure that for sure, is through passage of the Healthy Dog Import Act. I think I'll just fast forward here a little bit to this year and what our focus is. So, what are we going to do with the Healthy Dog Import Act? I've mentioned it. I mentioned what it does. I mentioned our appropriations efforts. And I've talked a little bit about what the agencies have done as we've gone along raising attention on this issue. So our objective is to get the Healthy Dog Import Act included in the 2023 Farm Bill, or some other bigger package that moves before then. And so that is why you'll look and see the list of our co-sponsors on our bills in the House and the Senate are made up predominantly of members of the House Agriculture Committee. That is by design. We want to ensure that this bill gets plugged into the must-pass Farm Bill. Now, the Farm Bill, 80% of that is the food stamp program. The other 20% is conservation, commodity payments. But this also has jurisdiction going back to 2008 when USDA got their first little bit of authority over dog imports. So it's a logical place for it to sit. And we have been spending time building the case for this to be included in that package because there's not a lot of bills that are standing alone passing in Congress that are of any significance. So when you have a big package where something like this we can fit in, that's our goal. We're also maintaining our effort on the appropriations. We're asking the appropriators for another $1 million this year. Ideally we build that through time, and I think we are demonstrating that to our bill sponsors, to the authorizers, to the agriculture committees, that we're serious about giving USDA the resources to do this because we don't want to end up getting a bill passed that can't be enforced. And I mentioned also we are going to continue our efforts with USDA and with CDC to ensure that the types of actions that they took last year continue to be in their toolkit moving forward. And that is a big priority for us. I think we should be hearing soon, right, about how and when they're gonna lift this CDC suspension, what their next steps are, and it's our job to make sure that they do it in the right way and that we don't end up back to where we were with no oversight. So maybe just getting to the call to action. I talked with some of you last night about who's your member of Congress. Are you willing to make a phone call? Well, I'm serious. We want that and we need that. Bill's co-sponsors, why are they important? So we have our lead sponsors. We've got Republican and Democrat co-sponsors. Right now we have 14 in the House and we have 6 in the Senate. How many do we need? More. Okay, that's the bottom line. Because we want to make the biggest and strongest case to the agriculture committees that this bill should be included in the Farm Bill, and there's not going to be any issue from a partisan basis, and we're not going to have anyone that raises concerns after it's in there. Because when they put their bill together, they want it to be safe. They don't want people coming along bringing amendments to strip things out. So that's why we need more co-sponsors. How do you get plugged in? We've left out front a survey. It's a real simple survey. Name, address, email, and then a couple of questions. Are you willing to make a phone call? Are you willing to send an email? Would you like to be included on a Zoom lobbying meeting with staff from the office of your member of Congress or your senator? And then you just hand it back to Patty, or we're also going to make it available with PDF. And Patty, I think we can email it to everybody who's here after this is over. And if you aren't able to fill it out while you're here and turn it in, fill it out electronically, email it back, and we'll reach out to you and we'll plug you in everywhere we can. Here, I'll get on to my last slide here, and apologies if this is in any way confusing, but I have here, this is a flow chart from progressive to conservative, and you can see where the leadership of Congress is on this flow chart. So you have Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi very far there on the blue side, and you have Senator McConnell and Congressman McCarthy very far there to the right side, and these dots are our co-sponsors. So the point I'm making here with this is there is no member out there who's too conservative for us to go after to get on this bill because we've already got them. And there's nobody who's too progressive because we've already got them too. Right in the middle is where we are shooting for, but we'll take everybody. So your member of Congress is a potential co-sponsor for this bill, right? And that's the message. So I don't care what you think about your member. You're not getting very much further to the left or right than this right here. And I want to be clear, these are pictures. They're not our co-sponsors. They're just to show you what these dots, where kind of where they line up on the political side. So maybe I'll stop there and just reiterate our interest in having you participate. We've already called on a few of you. Dr. Greer joined a Zoom meeting with Senator Baldwin's staff from Wisconsin. We had Dr. Goldman join a couple of meetings with the Connecticut delegation via Zoom. And don't worry if you don't think you're ill prepared, or you think you're ill prepared, or you don't know how to talk to a staffer from a member of Congress. Well, they're 22 and 23 years old, so you can do it, right? It's not that tough. The important thing is having someone who is actually a constituent to validate us, right? A lot of what we have been telling Congress here and the USDA and the CDC is now being validated, and it's not coming out as their own words, as I read earlier, but nothing helps better than having someone who's from the state or from the district on the phone call validating me, validating Patty, validating the other lobbyists on my team. And we can hop on the phone and talk through before we get on one of those calls. We can draft an email for you to send. We can make it as easy as possible. And I think you'll find, if you talk to Dr. Greer, if you talk to Dr. Goldman or Patty, that it's not tough. You can do it, and we would greatly value that because it'll help us build the co-sponsors we need to make the case to the agriculture committees to get this in the Farm Bill and get it done, so that we don't have to see dog suspensions from 113 countries when we don't know when it's going to end or what it's going to look like afterwards, and we don't have to face kind of on a piecemeal basis addressing the threats of zoonotic diseases or diseases like African swine fever. We can get this system in place, as Dr. Peterson said. We need the infrastructure. This bill is the basic infrastructure. It's reasonable, and we're making great strides, and people are agreeing with us. The agencies are agreeing, and as you can see, all across party lines, they're agreeing with us. We just got to get more of them, and we got to get it done. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you for having me here.
Andrew, if you wouldn't mind staying up there, and Dr. Christie will come up and join you. We're going to take some time to do some Q&As. Cindy Buckmaster, our Energizer Bunny, is going to be running around, so raise your hand if you have a question. And yeah, please, better her than me. We'll get done by 9:45 when we'll have our break. Thank you.
Thank you. This question's for Dr. Peterson. Currently, the RSAT slide agglutination test is not available, and according to our vendors, it is not going to be reintroduced. Do you have any suggestions for that? Our clinic did tons of brucella testing in-house, and now we send them out, which works very well, but the client does not get the immediate response time.
Now? Ooh, yes. So, I'm about to get technical. You ready? All right. Do you know if the MER set is available? It's using beta mercaptan. Oh, in-house. Okay. Yeah. So the big challenge is that the infrastructure for running these tests well is difficult for some labs, so they prefer to send out. And I know that that means longer times. Um, I don't have a better answer aside from this is a market thing, right?
Absolutely.
So the more you scream about we're a market, we're going to test, the better access you're going to have.
Thank you.
Dr. Peterson, I wanted to ask you about some of these diseases that you're particularly interested in seem to be endemic in less developed countries. And I wanted to have you just address the issue as far as the personnel and the technology available in those countries for studying these and how it affects the possibility for prevention and new treatments and so forth, because they may not be particularly well-to-do markets, and does that issue complications for folks like you that are studying them?
Thank you for that question. So, to be clear, I'm never going to say that we don't want more money or resources put into these things. It's fascinating. Actually, dog markets in Europe drive creation of new drugs and technologies for leishmania because that market is strong compared to the places where people get it. So that's really where veterinary medicine is leading human. In terms of brucella, that also is found globally. So I think with creative use of marketing, they are finding ways to create products in markets where we can to help those who can't. Does that, the technology, so to answer your question a little more directly, I do work in India and Brazil and Ethiopia. There are wonderful programs through the National Institutes of Health, specifically NIAID, and you guys can curse or hiss or whatever you want to do, but that's who I get my funding from. And it is working internationally to help the places find the diseases so that they don't come to us.
Hello. 2 questions. They're mostly just fun facts that I don't think I caught all of the information on from you. You were talking about how sandflies were in correlation with the, is it Leish, but how do you pronounce the whole word?
Leishmaniasis.
Leishmaniasis. How far do those sandflies travel? You said because of the hair on their wings they don't do as well.
I'm not sure we know that the hair on the wings specifically is what slows them down. We don't have people who do great like sandfly wing strength studies, believe it or not. But they really only go 10 to 15 meters. And then that, as you might imagine, allows us to do really nice spatiotemporal modeling, space and time modeling, to look at where they are, what's infected, when are the flies infected, and how are flies, dogs, and people interacting. I'm glad you're already deep diving on me.
Yes, absolutely. The only other question I had is, can other flies transfer this to dogs? Because I know that you were focusing on sandflies, but are there other flies?
Yeah. So if you want to spend a week in June with me, I can teach you everything you want to know.
That's my birthday month.
But the quick entomology lesson is there's 2 different types of vectors. There are mechanical vectors and biological vectors. Mechanical vectors are your flying syringes. They bite you, they move something to somebody else. Sandflies are a biological vector, which means that there's a whole life cycle that goes in the sandfly, and that's actually where parasite sex happens. So the sandfly has a special relationship with the parasite, I guess, if I didn't already make that clear. There are mechanical vectors that have been shown to do this. So for instance, there's been an outbreak of cutaneous leishmaniasis in Australia in wallabies caused by flying midges. I'm full of really great trivia if any of you want to talk to me at lunch. Midges. No-see-ums, the awful things that go through your screens and bite you. Yeah, those.
Thank you.
I have maybe two-parter, and Patty might be able to answer part of this. This is for the gentleman. Is there a organized group that represents shelters, like GFAS, like Global Federated Sanctuaries, Patty? And if so, is there any opposition from that type of group or collaboration against the bill? Is there any pushback because shelters want these, right, because supply and demand. So do they have any organized grouping, or how does that work?
That's a great question, and Patty can add in if I see anything wrong. But to date, we have not seen any opposition articulated publicly to the bill. I think we, through a lot of careful derivations of the bill, tried to put this in such a way that it's really hard to oppose it. And knowing that there could be, right, because we mentioned those that want to get around the very limited requirements that are already there in place, and the economic structure that the CDC representative, Dr. Parachi, just acknowledged too in her presentation, that there's an economic commercial business going on here that will potentially be challenged by this infrastructure if we get it put in place. Now, I think the one thing we have seen is since CDC put their suspension in place, there has been a rally to try to get that lifted, right? I mean, we have seen a letter from, I think they had about 50 members of Congress that said, CDC, you really need to get this lifted. Outside of that, there's been no direct public attack on our bill. I think you're right, what you're saying. We potentially will see some opposition for this. It's going to be behind the scenes mostly because there's nothing I don't think that they have to stand on publicly the way that this is framed. But I have not seen any official organization that is kind of leading the charge. But as quickly as they got that letter put together, they're out there.
Shelters don't come under any umbrella organization? Or okay, or do they have one generally?
Patty said the National Animal Control Association.
And I'll just quickly add, as you might imagine, because what I work on is infectious diseases in companion animals, I've done a lot of work with the American Association of Shelter Vets. They don't want these diseases in their shelters at all. It just leads to disaster.
Okay, for Dr. Peterson, this is a kind of a what-if scenario question. A couple years ago, or last year actually, a rumor was spread from a group of Mexican breeders coming to our Bulldog National that one of their top handlers' dogs had tested positive for brucellosis, but he was trying to keep it secret so he could come and show the dog anyway. So it turned out to be rumor, not true, but as I was sitting there thinking about what would have been the possible ramifications of a dog like that showing up in a closed, confined show situation, you know, obviously there's passing in a breeding situation, but how contagious is that in a more like a casual dog show type situation?
So I love it when I get to talk about sex organs in the conference. Um, much like where the sperm is coming from, and I talked about, the effects that were happening there and in the epididymis and in the testes, that, the same piping is what the urine goes through, right? So urine can contain bacteria as well. It's used diagnostically, not to the same insanely high levels as aborted fluids or semen even, but it is there. And we know that male dogs love to urinate on things, so that's what we're worried about.
And speaking of talking about dog sex at nearly every conference, Dr. Greer has a question.
Thank you. I appreciate that reputation. So I have two questions. One is, I think testing for brucellosis prior to import makes sense, and I think that's a manageable process, but how do we possibly put into place interstate movement of dogs and brucella testing? Because people drive back and forth across state lines all the time. So not only that, but it's coupled with the lack of in-house testing currently, and there's certainly tests that are in the pipeline to have FDA approval, but right now we don't have anything we can do in-house. And I think that as that changes, we're going to see the diagnostic labs that have been running those tests be overwhelmed with the number of cases, because we're now having to submit everything like Dr. Smith. Question number two is, what prevents fraudulent microchips from being produced, where hundreds and hundreds, thousands of microchips of the exact same number are put into them, so that anytime a dog is scanned, they could have that universal microchip put into them, and you wouldn't be able to distinguish that dog from the other jillion dogs that had the same microchip number? Who oversees that?
Well, I'm going to take the first question, and I might pass the second one. So I think with anything, if we are going to talk about rolling out different testing requirements, we have to start planning the infrastructure for that now, of course. And that's why I was talking about the market, right? I think interstate is a lofty goal, and the reason why I talk about interstate is because within the Midwest, that's where we're seeing cases from still. It could be, this is me choosing my example so I don't cause too much trouble. We have learned in terms of human behavior that any bar, any request, maybe not always without loopholes, but on human behavior decreases bad human behavior. And I think even if there's some, like a vet sign off that the dog was tested, that sort of burden of proof would help. That's all I'm going to say. And the one thing I will say, maybe just as a lead off to help you think about how to answer the second half, I know, I'm mean and evil. So because of mad cow disease, they're now going to universal ID of cattle to help track these sorts of things. And they have come up with the infrastructure to ensure that that is unique and real. And we could then do a similar sort of infrastructure in other species should we want to.
Yeah, and I'll give it my best shot. It is terrifying to think that if we move to some kind of permanent ID, that there's still a threat out there for fraud, and I guess that's in any situation. It does seem that that USDA in particular, having moved to their e-permit system, it has this concept of electronic data more and more in their purview and what they're doing, actually throughout the department. I think if we're able to get a permanent ID, and our bill doesn't specify microchip, but what else is there, right? A tattoo. So if we tie that to data, that paperwork that's submitted electronically to the department, shared with Customs and Border, and then that microchip is then checked at the point of entry when the dog is inspected, I think that is our best shot at getting some kind of a handle on the situation. I mean, we would have to look into how do we ensure that we avoid the fraud situation in the microchip perspective of it, because we have not considered that. Is that something that is pretty rampant and well?
Around it, somebody will figure
Yeah,
it out.
no, it's a good point.
So the good news about a common ID is that's going to be picked up pretty quick when you start getting, because if it's in a big data system, as soon as you get multiples, that's going to trigger.
Yeah.
Right.
I have no idea if it's built into the cross checks, but you can imagine that there's a way around anything. And until the data all becomes electronic, and I think now it's not exclusively electronic, I think there's still some, I mean, we know that people download forms and fill them out fraudulently. So if there's a way around it, people are signing their own health certificates as a veterinarian. So if there's a way around it, people are going to try and game the system.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and one of the other pieces of the requirement on the certificate of veterinary inspection is it has to be signed by a certified veterinarian approved by APHIS. And now that in itself, right, we're still going to have to follow that through the rulemaking process and through the implementation, because there's seems to be a large appetite for avoiding regulation from some folks in this area. I hope I said that delicately enough. But our eyes are wide open. So hopefully this will give USDA the tools to put that infrastructure in place that Dr. Peterson talked about earlier.
Dr. Chrissy, I had a question. Not that I fortunately don't have a quote unquote dog in this fight, but you mentioned on the two diseases that you talked about that it seemed that the only solution, and maybe I misunderstood this, and that's why I'm asking, was to euthanize the animals. Is that, I mean, is there no treatment? Is there no anything for that? Or do you just, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Just, it seems kind of scary.
Yeah, sure. So for brucella, there are antibiotics that you can give that can make a dog have less clinical signs, but they will still have the bacteria in their body and they will still be shedding it. And if you're in a kennel situation, that's disaster. So that's why what is almost always suggested is euthanasia for that. And then very good kennel testing. And that's why I always, I never forget about brucella, because especially for breeders, it's a nightmare. For leishmania, there are drugs. Again, this can get complicated quick, but what the World Health Organization has done is they've saved some drugs for human use in endemic countries. We are officially not endemic, so we're trying to gain evidence of how good those drugs are in dogs, but because we don't get, thankfully, we don't get so many of those, so we're slowly building, can we actually get what's called sterile cure using the good human drugs? I've got the database started, and hopefully we'll know that soon. To date, what's thought is that using the reject human drugs, dogs will get sick again or recrudesce, and then you're really just kind of managing. You do drop the parasite burden low enough so that it's unlikely that a person will get it, and it's been shown that you're less likely to transmit out through the fly, should we be in a fly transmission situation.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one maybe is just a thought. Dogs are not seen as agriculture. So if we are dog breeders, the dog business, I'm not really sure how that works, but would that be something that would be helpful with the Healthy Dog Importation Act, is if, and I don't even know how that would be done, but if we petitioned or whatever to become part of agriculture?
Yeah, I think one concept we heard contemplated was trying to get dogs considered to be farm animals, because sometimes dogs live on farms. I don't think we're going to get that to fly, but we are tying into the Animal Health Protection Act, which USDA Veterinary Services has oversight of. And that's the authority that they use to restrict imports of live cattle, of poultry, dairy cows, actually pet birds. So there's a logical fit here. And the way that, Julian brilliantly put this together, the base of it, it puts it under, right, the treatment, the same authority that USDA uses to oversee agriculture animals without changing them to be considered by definition farm animals. Because I think just on the face of that, it's hard for us to go to members of Congress and say we need these to be considered farm animals, because it's something that others that have a different agenda can go to and say, well, they just want to treat our pets like livestock, right? But we can accomplish the same thing we want to by the way that this puts this under USDA's authority. I think it's a spot on point.
Okay, and then one other question on brucellosis. I'm from Colorado. Colorado imports about 50,000 dogs a year, at least last year they did. Not necessarily out of country, but a lot from Texas, a lot from Oklahoma. The big thing right now, too, is moving mother dogs with babies, because you can move them into Colorado under 8 weeks of age if they come with a mother dog. So the rescues and shelters are importing, and people are literally breeding dogs and selling them with the babies. And they can bring them into Colorado. The puppies sell quickly. The mothers don't sell so fast. They're packaged with maybe a deaf dog, a blind dog, and a three-legged dog, just as, okay? And then these dogs are housed. The dogs that can't sell are housed until they can get their next package deal. So disease is a huge concern in Colorado, and trying to come up with basic rules to help control disease. Brucellosis, I think we have a new strain of brucellosis in Colorado. We've brought in a new strain of rabies into Colorado. Patty, is that, I think? So Patty's just saying that she spoke with the state vet, and brucellosis has tripled in Colorado over the years. So I see in the dog breeding industry, commercial dog breeding, show breeding, that it seems like the testing and stuff is realistic because of some of the wait times. And I feel like as breeders, we've done a really good job to screen for brucellosis. But how would a shelter or rescue even screen if you got a test and then you have to wait 24, 30 days, and we're bringing in underaged puppies? Is there any realistic way to try to control brucellosis in the rescue and shelter industry? It seems like, that's the incubation period seems to be a problem. Because, right, you have to do 2 tests for brucellosis, I think?
So officially, to diagnose a dog, like out of vet practice, we would ask for 2 tests. When you start talking about populations, and certainly the shelter population is one, just using a screening test, which is going to pick up the positives, they might have false positives, but you're going to pick up the positives, is the way you want to go. So that's one test. As you are hearing, the access to those tests is a bit of a challenge right now. But I do know that many shelters have agreements, for instance, directly with IDEX or other testing companies, where they really batch them out and they do get rapid results. So I don't think it's impossible. I think it's just going to take coordination and discussion. But, again, the shelter vets don't want, with everything else they're dealing with, they don't want to deal with brucella too.
Real quick, we've been told that given antibiotics can make a false negative. Is that, you want to speak to that? Is that an IDEX issue or the SNAP test kind of thing?
I'm not sure there's a snap test for brucella, as far as I've heard. Yeah. So you can, the tests that we're talking about, they're all testing for antibodies. Antibodies go up when you have lots of inflammation. They're going to come down if you treat with an antibiotic and get rid of that inflammation. Any disease, this is truth. That's bacterial. Again, not viral diseases. You don't treat viruses with with an antibiotic, please. So you do want to make sure that testing happens before any sort of treatment, and hopefully I've emphasized that treatment isn't really going to get you out of the exposure challenge anyway.
Okay, I've been notified by Patty Clegan, she is all over the time thing, that we have only time for one more question, and the lucky winner is...
Thank you. I have a question. As far as with leishmaniasis, there was some confusion for prevention, whether or not just topicals were effective, if the oral products that you're alluding to were also effective.
In endemic countries, topicals, because of their time to action, have better time to kill of the sandfly, but the orals do work as well. The most recent isoxazonids have not had nice papers published on their effect yet, but I was literally at a conference 3 weeks ago where I know that work is coming out soon.
Okay, and the speakers will be here for a while, and Patty mentioned in the beginning the power of networking, and so feel free to approach them, during lunch or whenever, during some downtime, and ask more questions. Fantastic Q&A. Thank you.